Have you ever wondered if one day looking back you realize you've lived your whole life, fulfilling responsibilities, but never truly lived for yourself? Would you still have the courage to change? In the American Wild West, at the end of the 19th century, there were men who knew nothing of the concept of choosing for happiness. They only knew how to choose what needed to be done. They chose to stand firm when the ground cracked and dry. They chose to endure when the winter seemed endless. They chose to persevere, even when all that remained in their homes was the sound of the wind and cold meals. 4 men like them live in Red Willow Valley, a valley so harsh that even hope must learn to survive. They don't dream. They're not romantic. They don't believe in miracles. They believe in calloused hands and mornings spent waking up with nothing left to look forward to. Then, a decision was made. No fuss, no nobility. Just a cold, practical choice: order wives by letter so the ranch could continue to exist. But if it were you, what would you do when the survival of your family rested on your shoulders and your heart was too weary to hope? Will you reject your feelings to uphold your responsibilities? Or will you take one last gamble on something you never dared to believe in? This story isn't asking you about ideal love. It's asking about real life, where quiet men have to choose between continuing to endure or learning to open their hearts. If you've ever been the one bearing the burden, if you've ever put others before yourself, if you've ever thought maybe this is all I need in life, please stay with us. If this story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to embark on a slow, warm, and very real journey where weary hearts find reason to believe again. Red Willow Valley isn't a place to find your fortune. It's a place to go when you've run out of options. The wind here doesn't just blow across the prairie, it scratches at the skin, carrying dry dust and the smell of barren earth. Summer is short, the sun scorching your shoulders. Winter is long, silent, and unforgiving. Snow blankets the old wooden fences, burying the entire valley in a silence that lasts for months. In the midst of that land, Hawthorne Ranch stands there, not proud, not conspicuous, just enduring like the people who live there. The 4 Hawthorne brothers grew up on this land. They learned to work before they learned to dream. They learned to endure before they learned to express their feelings. For them, life wasn't a question of, what do I want, but what do I do next? The eldest brother, Caleb Hawthorne, had the air of a man accustomed to being at the forefront of responsibility. His shoulders were broad, but his back was always slightly hunched, not because of age, but because of the invisible burden of years when he could not afford to falter. After the death of his parents, Caleb became the breadwinner without anyone asking if he was willing. He simply stood up as people stand up every morning in the West, because if he didn't, everything would fall apart. Caleb didn't say much. He believed in the numbers, in the seasons, in the amount of livestock left after each winter. And increasingly, those numbers told him an undeniable truth: this ranch couldn't continue like this forever. It's not because of a lack of labor. It's because of a lack of something else: life. The house was large but empty. Meals were just the sound of spoons clinking against bowls. Holidays passed like any other. It was good that no one was sick, but when something did happen, no one was there to care. No one kept the fire burning. No one turned a place to live into a home. Caleb understood that better than anyone, and that's why he was the first to think of the solution that many men in the West at the time had chosen: mail-order brides. It wasn't because of a longing for romance. It wasn't because of loneliness in the way people usually describe it. It was because he believed that for a ranch to survive, it needed women. It needed the presence of people who knew how to care, connect, and make life more human. Caleb's 3 younger brothers, Luke, Thomas, and Samuel, didn't object. Nor were they enthusiastic. To them, it was simply another part of the job, like mending the fence or leading the cattle through the winter. 4 men, 4 destinies accustomed to silence. 4 lives that never allowed themselves to dream of their own happiness. There are men like that. They spend their whole lives fulfilling their responsibilities, but when they look back, they're not sure who they are beyond the role life has assigned them. The Red Willow Valley continues to be windy. Ranch Hawthorne still stands there, waiting for something yet to be named. And far away on dusty roads leading west, horse-drawn carriages were rolling, carrying destinies about to change everything. That morning in Dry Creek began like any other morning. No church bells, no gunshots, only the wind blowing along the main dirt road carrying fine dust and the scent of dry grass that had been exposed to the sun for too long. This small town was accustomed to repetition. People woke up, opened their shops, exchanged a few pleasantries, and went on with their lives as if yesterday and today were not much different. The four Hawthorne brothers stood in front of the post office waiting in silence. They didn't speak much to each other. Caleb leaned slightly forward, his hands in the pockets of his thick coat. Luke leaned against a wooden post, his eyes fixed on the ground. Thomas gazed at the horizon as if searching for something far away. Samuel kept unbuttoning and rebuttoning his gloves, a habit he had whenever he felt uneasy. None of them could name what was coming. But everyone knew. The sound of horse-drawn carriage wheels echoed from afar, slow and steady, breaking the silence of Dry Creek. The sound caused several townspeople to look up. A man tying his horse in front of the blacksmith shop stopped. A woman pulled her shawl tighter around her neck as if sensing a change in the wind. The horse-drawn carriage appeared around the bend in the road. Not hurried, not ostentatious, but enough to draw all eyes to it. Caleb was the first to notice something was wrong, not because of the car, but because it was carrying too many people. When the carriage stopped in front of the post office, the coachman jumped down and brushed the dust off his coat. Then the wooden door at the back opened. A woman got out first, then the second person, then the third person, and finally, the fourth person. 4 women stood side by side on the dirt road of Dry Creek. Nobody said anything. It wasn't because they were exceptionally beautiful. It wasn't because they dressed unusually. They wore simple, pale-colored dresses frayed at the hem. Each carried only a small suitcase, enough for a few changes of clothes and essentials. Their shoes were covered in dust. Their hands were red from the cold wind. What made the atmosphere somber was the way they stood next to each other. The 4 women shared the same posture, the same silence in their eyes, and if you looked closer, there was something very familiar about their faces. Luke frowned. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Samuel stopped all movement of his hands. Caleb looked at them for a long time before slowly asking in a low, direct voice, "Are you from the east?" The woman in charge nodded slightly. She looked at Caleb with a calm, unassuming gaze, neither hesitant nor inviting. "Yes. We've come as requested in the letter." That answer should have put an end to all doubts, but instead it only opened up a longer silence. Caleb glanced at his 3 younger brothers. He knew what they were thinking because he was thinking the same thing. According to the letters that had been sent, each of the 4 brothers would be taking 1 woman, no more, no less. So why? 4 people at the same time on the same bus. Samuel couldn't hide the confusion in his eyes. "Excuse me," he began, his voice slightly hesitant. "Do you ladies know each other?" The youngest woman pursed her lips as if wanting to say something, but then stopping. The leader gently placed his hand on her arm, then looked at Samuel. "We are sisters," she said. "Biological sisters." There was no murmur, no dramatic reaction. Only a heavy silence fell over the dirt road of Dry Creek. Caleb felt as if someone had just pulled an invisible string taut between the 2 sides. A mistake, a misunderstanding, or something even more complicated. He looked at the 4 women again. Now he could see them more clearly. The lines around their eyes, the way they held their shoulders straight even in their weariness. The resemblance was undeniable. Luke turned away, letting out a soft sigh. Thomas tightened his grip on his coat strap. Samuel looked at Caleb, waiting. The entire town of Dry Creek seemed to be holding its breath. There are small mistakes in life, easy to correct, easy to forget, and there are mistakes, just the mere occurrence of which is enough to derail everything. Caleb knew that if he said no right now, it could be the end. The 4 women would return to the carriage. Dry Creek would return to its old rhythm. Ranch Hawthorne would continue to exist in its familiar absence. But he also knew something else. These 4 women had traveled a great deal, not just geographically. Margaret Callahan, the woman in charge, kept her gaze steady, but Caleb noticed her hands subtly tighten their grip on the handle of her suitcase. It wasn't the gesture of absolute confidence. It was the gesture of someone who had gone too far to easily turn back. Abigail stood beside her, silently observing, as if accustomed to waiting for others' decisions. Eleanor looked around the town, her eyes reflecting the sadness of someone who understood this might be their last chance. Grace, the youngest, tried to remain calm, but her gaze still betrayed an unhidden vulnerability. Caleb suddenly realized this was no longer just a matter of administrative error. This was the story of people who had staked their entire lives on a single decision. He thought of ranch, of cold meals, of long winters, and he also thought of something else, that perhaps sometimes life deliberately sends unplanned challenges just to see how people will choose to face them. If it were you, what would you do? Would you neatly correct the mistake, or would you stop, look more closely, and wonder if this was really a mistake, or just an unforeseen turn of events? Caleb took a deep breath. He hadn't said anything yet, but in that moment, amidst the dust and wind of Dry Creek, all initial plans were subtly disrupted, like a small crack appearing in the barren ground, signaling that what was to come would no longer be as simple as before. And it was from that silence that a new series of choices began to take shape, slow, heavy, but irreversible, leading them all into days of shared living, where none of them could have foreseen what awaited them. No one said anything more after the confession that they were sisters. Dry Creek seemed to hold her breath like an old person waiting to see how the next generation would handle a situation that was out of the ordinary. Caleb Hawthorne stood there, teetering on the edge of a decision that could change the lives of more people than he imagined. He knew rationally that everything had gone wrong from the start. The letters sent made no mention of the 4 women from the same family. The rules of marriages by letter were already fragile, and this mistake could easily be dismissed as an immediate error. Just a shake of the head, a firm statement. Sorry, this was a misunderstanding, and then it will all end. But Caleb wasn't in a hurry. He had never been one to act rashly. His gaze shifted from Margaret Callahan's face, slowly descending. Her shoes were clearly visible in the faint morning sunlight, cracked leather-worn heels, old stitches carefully mended. They weren't the shoes of a traveler. They were the shoes of someone who had walked for a long time on roads that offered no rest. Caleb glanced at the suitcases on the floor. No large trunks, no bulky belongings, just a few meager items, enough for the most essentials. He understood that feeling all too well when a person is forced to cram their entire life into a few possessions, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. Then he looked into their eyes. No begging, no demanding. Just the gaze of people who have gone too far to turn back without losing something within themselves. Margaret stood tall, as if accustomed to maintaining her posture even when her heart was failing. Abigail remained silent, her gaze more observant than spoken. Eleanor had the pensive air of someone who had once lived in her own world, now forced to leave it. Grace tried to appear strong, but her trembling hands spoke volumes. Caleb suddenly realized a simple but bitter truth. None of them had come here with dreams. They came for survival. He turned to his 3 brothers. Luke couldn't hide his confusion, but there was no malice in his eyes. Thomas was thoughtful, as if considering something beyond common sense. Samuel, on the other hand, looked at the women with a naive sympathy, a sympathy not yet worn down by life. Caleb knew that if he refused, his siblings would accept. They always accepted his decisions. That's what makes this responsibility even heavier. In the West, there's a lot of talk about rules, but men like Caleb Hawthorne were raised on something else: honor. Honor isn't found on paper. It's found in how a person treats those weaker than themselves in moments when no one forces them to be kind. Caleb took a deep breath, then spoke. His voice was low, not too high, but loud enough for everyone to hear. This could be a mistake, he said, and I have the right to refuse. No one objected. Margaret nodded slightly, as if she had been preparing for that statement for a long time. Caleb paused for a moment. Then he continued, "But you've gone too far to turn back just because of a mistake on paper." Luke lifted his head. Thomas turned completely around. Samuel let out a soft sigh, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. "You ladies can stay at our ranch," Caleb said slowly. "For a while. There are no promises, no guarantees, no dreams of the future. Just stay," he clarified, "until we know what to do next." Margaret gazed at him for a long time. Something stirred in her eyes, but she didn't let it show. "We didn't expect anything more," she replied. "Just a place to stand." Caleb nodded. He said nothing more. Honor for him required no lengthy explanation. The carriage was rearranged. The coachman turned around, heading towards Red Willow Valley. The 4 women climbed in, sitting close together, as if only such closeness could help them remain calm. Caleb got into the car last. His 3 younger siblings followed, none of them asking any further questions. There are decisions once made where silence is the clearest form of consent. The road to Hawthorne Ranch was longer than the road to town. The wind blew stronger. The landscape became more open. The prairie stretched out vast and promising nothing but challenges. Margaret sat opposite Caleb. They didn't speak. But in that silence a quiet acknowledgement was forming. They both understood that today's decision wasn't just a momentary act of compassion. It was a step into uncharted territory. Caleb gazed ahead where the Hawthorne Ranch gradually emerged from the gray earth against the vast sky. He didn't know what awaited them. He only knew that from the moment he said stay, everything had begun to change. Not out of love, not yet out of hope, but out of a very human choice, not turning away when you can reach out. And as the horse-drawn carriage rolled through the old wooden gate of the Hawthorne Ranch, none of them realized that the decision made in silence would be the first step toward something much larger, something not born of planning, but of the enduring presence of people forced to learn to live together. Ranch Hawthorne was accustomed to the silence of men, a silence heavy with the smell of sweat, dry wood, and the repetition of habits over the years. Here everything had its fixed place. Saddles hung on old hooks, shoes were left by the door, the dining table only had room for 4, and each man knew when to speak and when to be silent. The appearance of the 4 women didn't come like a storm. It came like a discordant note, slow but persistent. On that very first morning, Caleb realized the ranch no longer belonged to its familiar rhythm. He woke up early as usual, stepped out of his room intending to get some cold coffee and head to the stables. But instead of the familiar cold kitchen, he heard the crackling of fire. Margaret Callahan stood by the stove, quiet, unhurried. Her hair was neatly tied back, her sleeves rolled up just enough. On the table, a loaf of bread lay on a clean tablecloth. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted slowly through the air, a scent this ranch had been without for a very long time. Caleb paused at the doorway. He didn't step inside immediately, as if afraid to interrupt something fragile. Luke appeared behind him, then Thomas, then Samuel. The 4 men stood there silent as boys entering a house they hadn't built themselves for the first time. "Breakfast is almost ready," Margaret said, her voice low and calm as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. No one answered immediately. Not because they were suspicious, but because they didn't know how to react. The first meal, consisting of warm bread, took place in an awkward silence. The knife slicing the bread made a soft sound. The butter melted slowly on the surface of the bread. Samuel ate faster than usual, as if afraid someone would take his share. Luke ate slowly, observing. Thomas bowed his head, but his eyes never left Margaret's hands as she poured coffee. Caleb took the first bite, then paused for a moment. He realized he had forgotten this feeling, the feeling of being cared for even though no one had said it out loud. After the meal, when the 4 brothers had gone out to work as usual, the ranch began to change in very small ways. The floor was swept, not a thorough cleaning, but just enough to prevent dust from accumulating in a thick layer. Eleanor did it in silence, as if she were having a conversation with herself with each stroke of the broom. Abigail rearranged the dish rack, adding nothing new, just putting everything in its place for easier access. Grace brought water to the barn, timidly placing the bucket near the door, then stepping back as Luke approached, but their eyes met for a brief moment. The men were awkward, not because they were uncomfortable, but because they were unfamiliar with it. Luke almost forgot where he'd put his hoe, as it was now hanging up instead of on the floor. Thomas searched for his old coat and found it had been mended. Samuel hesitated when he noticed an extra thin blanket on his bed, unnecessary but warmer. No one asked. No one complained. But the presence of women meant the ranch was no longer just a place to exist. Caleb observed everything from a distance. He didn't stop it, but he didn't interfere either. Margaret Callahan didn't give orders. She simply did what needed to be done, as if this ranch had been waiting for her all along. She didn't try to change it. She simply listened. Listened to the wind through the cracks in the doors. Listened to the men's footsteps coming and going each evening. Listened to the silences between them. One afternoon, as Luke was carrying his bundle of firewood inside, he paused for a second. On the table there was a pot of warm water. No one had told him to drink it, but he did. That's how it all begins, not with big words, but with small actions. Thomas and Eleanor began talking more, mostly about books. An old book Eleanor had brought with her from the East, its pages yellowed, became their first connection. They didn't discuss the past. They only talked about the words that reminded them that the world had once been much larger than the land they were standing on. Samuel helped Grace fix the fence. He talked more than usual. She listened, sometimes chuckling softly. Grace's innocence didn't break the ranch but seeped into it like the first light of day. Caleb and Margaret were different. They rarely spoke privately, but they saw each other in the details. Caleb realized Margaret knew exactly when to be silent and when to appear. She didn't go into the stables. She didn't ask about the work in the fields. But she knew which days Caleb came home later, and on those days the meal was left warm on the stove longer. Margaret also noticed that Caleb didn't ask questions, but he was always attentive. When she coughed lightly, he added more wood to the fire. When she stood for too long, he pulled a chair closer. No one would call it caring. But they both understood. Ranch Hawthorne, once a closed, male-dominated world, is being disrupted not by power but by a gentle presence. Everyday clashes don't cause major conflicts. They simply force people to slow down, to be more observant, to learn to live with a different rhythm. There were evenings when the whole family would sit and eat by the light of an oil lamp. No one told jokes. No one spoke flowery words. But the silence was no longer empty. It carried the weight of peace. Caleb sat at the head of the table, looking around. He didn't say anything, but he knew this ranch was beginning to breathe. And as night fell over Red Willow Valley, amidst the familiar sound of the wind and the more stable glow of the hearth fire than ever before, a new feeling crept in, a feeling that perhaps living together wasn't just a temporary solution, but the first step toward something deeper, quietly taking shape. No one in Hawthorne Ranch calls what's happening change. It's happening too slowly to have a name. Like how a quiet winter gives way to spring, no sound, no warning, until one day you realize the snow has melted. Margaret Callahan never stood in the middle of a room and said, "From now on we will live differently." She didn't need that. She simply started with small, consistent things, as if she had been doing them her whole life. In the mornings, she was the first to get up, without waking anyone, without making a sound. She lit the fire, boiled water, and placed the dough on the table. She didn't bake every day, only on colder, windier days, or when the men of the house came home later than the previous evening. Margaret learned to observe the rhythm of ranch life and quietly adjusted herself accordingly. She assigned tasks to her daughters, but not by command. Abigail naturally took on the kitchen chores. Eleanor took care of the corners of the house, the lighting things that seemed unnecessary but helped ease the fatigue. Grace did the tasks outside, closest to the men, carrying water, repairing the fence, gathering firewood, things that made her feel more than just a guest. Ranch Hawthorne began to have structure. Not the structure of rules, but the structure of life. Meal times became more regular. No one forced it, but everyone gradually got used to returning on time. A tablecloth appeared on the table. Not new, not beautiful, but clean and regularly washed. A vase of dried flowers sat in the corner, just a few sprigs of weeds Margaret had picked in the field, but they made the room less bare. Caleb saw it all, and he didn't intervene. He was a man accustomed to keeping his distance from emotions. He understood that what was happening was for the best. But he also understood something else. All good things can lead to complacency. And complacency in this land often comes at a price. Caleb was both grateful and wary. He was grateful the ranch was no longer just a workplace. He saw his brothers eating more slowly, talking more, and laughing rarely, though rarely more. He saw Samuel no longer avoiding Grace's gaze. He saw Luke becoming less withdrawn. He saw Thomas starting to read by the oil lamp instead of falling asleep after meals. But Caleb was also wary. He reminded himself, this is only temporary. They haven't made any promises. They're not bound by any obligations. Margaret Callahan understood that. Perhaps she understood it better than anyone else. She didn't cross the invisible line Caleb had drawn. She didn't call this ranch home in front of him. She didn't ask about the future. She simply made the present a little more worth living. On some afternoons, Margaret would sit by the window mending clothes. The late afternoon sun would fall on her shoulders. Caleb would walk by, pause for a second, then continue on his way. No words, but they both sensed each other's presence, innocent, unapologetic. One day a strong wind blew. Night fell quickly. When the men arrived home, the stove was already lit. The soup was ready. No one had to say, "It's cold today." Everyone knew. In that moment, Caleb suddenly realized something that made him uneasy. This ranch was becoming a home. And a home is something that can't be built in a day, but once you've started, it's very hard to go back to square one. He remembered his father, a tough, taciturn man, but one who always sat in his usual spot at the table every evening. He remembered his mother, who never spoke of love but always saved the hottest part of her meal for her husband. When they were gone, this ranch remained, but the home was gone. Caleb had spent years just keeping the ranch. He had never even considered rebuilding a home. Margaret was unaware of those thoughts, or if she were, she wouldn't reveal them. She simply continued doing what she believed was right, creating a gentle order where people could rely on each other without feeling vulnerable. Abigail began keeping a record of expenses. Eleanor taught Samuel how to read more slowly to understand more deeply. Grace brought laughter to corners of the ranch that had once only heard the wind. No one was trying to change anyone, but everyone was changing little by little. One evening after dinner, Margaret got up to gather the dishes. Luke instinctively stood up to help. He paused for a second as if unsure if it was appropriate. Margaret looked at him and nodded slightly. Luke picked up the dishes awkwardly but seriously. Caleb gazed at the scene for a long time. Not because it was grand, but because it was familiar in a way he had forgotten. Houses don't just appear out of nowhere. That saying echoed in Caleb's head, not from anyone else but as a truth he once knew, then forgot. That night, when everyone was asleep, Caleb sat alone at the table. The oil lamp burned low. He heard the wind outside, as it always did. But inside the house, something was different. The space was no longer empty. He understood that from now on, every decision he made would affect not only the ranch, but also the people who were beginning to call this place home. And that realization, both warm and heavy, prepared Caleb to face the distinct bonds that were forming, each with its own rhythm, and none that could be taken lightly. In the days that followed, Ranch Hawthorne was no longer measured by work completed or the number of cattle that survived the cold. It began to be measured by the times people spent together without needing a reason. No one named what was forming, but invisible, thin yet strong threads silently connected one person to another. Luke Hawthorne was the first to sense the change, though he never admitted it. Luke was accustomed to the rigid neatness of Western men. Things were done in their proper places, right and wrong were clearly defined. And because of that, he frequently clashed with Abigail Callahan, not out of hatred, but because neither of them was used to backing down. Abigail wasn't the gentle woman one might expect. She spoke little, but each word was clear. When Luke left utensils scattered in the kitchen, Abigail tidied them up. When Luke frowned, she didn't explain. The initial conflict stemmed from such small things, but then Luke realized Abigail didn't want to control him. She just wanted things to run better for everyone. One afternoon, as Luke was repairing the barn door, he noticed Abigail had brought out water and placed it nearby. No word, no expectant look, just a timely gesture. Luke drank, then nodded. From that day on, he began asking questions before moving furniture. Abigail also began explaining instead of remaining silent. The confrontation didn't disappear, it transformed into respect, and for Luke that was the only form of intimacy he knew how to maintain. Thomas Hawthorne was different. He lived more in his inner world than in the fields outside. To Thomas, Eleanor Callahan wasn't a woman from the East, she was a door. One evening, as Eleanor read a passage from an old book by the lamplight, Thomas stood in the doorway listening. It wasn't the words that made him stop, but the way Eleanor read, slow, steady, as if each word held a memory. They began talking about books, then about places they had been, things they had lost. Eleanor spoke of quiet reading rooms, of music playing on rainy afternoons. Thomas spoke of prairies, of long, nameless winters. Two different worlds, yet not excluding each other. They sat side by side, each holding a piece of memory, not trying to mix them, simply placing them parallel. For Thomas, that was the art of companionship. Samuel Hawthorne and Grace Callahan had a completely different rhythm. They were younger, and in their eyes there was still a light that time hadn't yet dimmed. Samuel talked about little things, a newborn horse, a morning with less wind than usual. Grace listened, asked questions, and laughed when Samuel was flustered. Grace's innocence didn't make Samuel impulsive. It made him want to be better, to protect what was fragile. They worked together in the yard, their hands covered in mud, their faces red from the sun. No promises, no far-reaching plans. Just the simple hope that tomorrow there would still be someone standing beside them. And then there were two people who were always in the middle of all those threads, Caleb Hawthorne and Margaret Callahan. They lacked any clearly defined private moments. No lingering glances, no tender words. Their bond was built on responsibility upon responsibility. Caleb realized Margaret always knew what the ranch needed before he could even say it. Margaret realized Caleb always stood in the most difficult place, not because he wanted to, but because no one else would. They talked about reality. Winter was coming, the food supply, the fence needed repairing. But in each of those conversations there was an unspoken acknowledgement that both were carrying more than their share. Neither sought salvation from the other. But the other's presence made the burden less solitary. Caleb had never thought of love in the way people usually described it. For him, love wasn't an explosive emotion. It was waking up each morning knowing that someone understood why he had to keep going. Margaret felt the same way. She didn't dream of promises. She just needed a man strong enough to help her keep things from falling apart. There's no love at first sight in Hawthorne Ranch. Just repetitive days, evenings spent together at the same table, unconsciously waiting for the other person to arrive so everyone can start the meal. Affection builds from things like that, slow but deep. And it is, as these bonds gradually become clear, quiet but strong, that Ranch Hawthorne enters a new phase where people not only live side by side but begin to carry each other's pasts, and a secret that has been kept too long will soon find a way to speak. The secret arrived without a sound. It came on an afternoon so ordinary that no one noticed: a gentle breeze, soft sunshine. Hawthorne Ranch drifting along like any other, seemingly undisturbed by anything that could disrupt the fragile tranquility it had just found. Margaret Callahan received the letter when the mailman arrived at the ranch later than usual. The envelope was cream-colored, the corners worn, and the handwriting so familiar that she knew at a glance where it was from: the East. The place she and her sisters had left without looking back but had never truly escaped. Margaret didn't open the letter right away. She held it in her hand for a long time, as if the weight of the envelope alone was enough to weigh heavily on her heart. She knew that some things would continue to exist if they weren't read. But once read, they demanded confrontation. She waited until evening. She waited until the ranch lights were on. She waited until her sisters had gone to their rooms. She waited until the men's chatter outside had died down. Only when the kitchen returned to its familiar silence did Margaret sit down at the table, place the letter before her, and slowly open it. The handwriting in the letter was hurried, lacking its usual neatness. The writer was straightforward. No questions were asked. No concern was found on whether Margaret wanted to hear it or not. Their father, a name the Callahan family had tried to avoid mentioning for years, was once again dragged out of the past. Margaret read each line slowly and carefully. Every word was like a thin sheet of ice cutting deep into her memory. The writer mentioned withheld documents, decisions signed in silence, debts that never belonged to their family yet were attributed to their father's name like a verdict without a trial. Their father was not a criminal. He was a man who believed in creativity and hard work, and that a good enough idea would find its place. It was that very belief that made him a target. The Callahan family wasn't destroyed overnight. They were worn down. Step by step, small decisions by decision, promises left unfulfilled. Margaret folded the letter, her hand not trembling, but her breathing slowed. She had lived long enough to understand that some tragedies don't need tears. They just need time. Abigail was the first to notice something was wrong. The next morning, when Margaret forgot to put the napkin on the table, something that had never happened before, Abigail looked at her sister longer than usual. Eleanor noticed Margaret's gaze was more distant, as if looking across the ranch, across the prairie, to a very different place. Grace didn't ask. She just moved closer. In the evening, when everything was finished, Margaret called the children together. No one sat down immediately. They stood by the table as if preparing to hear something unpleasant. Margaret told the story. No embellishments, no coloring. She recounted the final years of their father, a man falsely accused, controlled, and deprived of the right to defend his honor. She spoke of the family being forced into silence, for every act of resistance led to greater loss. She spoke of why they had to leave the East, not out of cowardice, but because there was no other way to live authentically. And then Margaret mentioned a name. Not loudly, not angrily. Edgar Whitmore. The name fell into the room like a cold object. Abigail clenched her fists slightly. Eleanor lowered her head. Grace swallowed hard. Whitmore wasn't a frequent figure in their stories, but he was always there in the shadows of decisions, in unsigned documents, in whispers that made people turn away. He still hasn't given up, Margaret said. Not because of us, but because of what Father left behind. No one asked what it was. They all understood it was the truth. Secrets like these cannot remain buried forever. They are just waiting for the right moment. Margaret didn't tell Caleb right away, not because she didn't believe him, but because she understood it would put him in an unfair position. Ranch Hawthorne had only recently found stability. Dragging a dangerous past into that situation wasn't something she wanted, but secrets have their own ways of being revealed. Caleb noticed the change in Margaret even before she spoke. He saw she was quieter. He saw her eyes become wary whenever a stranger passed by. He saw her pause for a long time when the East was mentioned. One evening after the whole family had gone to sleep, Caleb was mending a horse's saddle when Margaret came in. She didn't beat around the bush. She placed the letter on the table. Caleb read. He remained silent for a long time. He was no stranger to the legal intrigues or power struggles of the East. But he understood one thing very clearly. The Callahan family carried more than just meager baggage. They carried a danger yet to be seen but real enough to be taken lightly. "I'm not going to drag you into this," Margaret said. "If necessary, we'll leave." That statement made Caleb look up. Not out of anger, but out of understanding. He looked at the woman before him not as a guest but as a part of this ranch, a part that had quietly kept everything standing. "What has happened here," Caleb said slowly, "is no longer a private matter." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She knew that from this moment on everything had changed. The secret kept for too long finally found a way to breathe. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to sow a quiet sense of unease that the peaceful days at Hawthorne Ranch might be just a lull before the past finds its way back, this time not in letters but through the first signs of danger silently approaching. The first sign of danger didn't come from gunfire nor from threats. It came from a seemingly harmless question, and from eyes that didn't belong here. Caleb Hawthorne realized this one afternoon when he went down to Dry Creek to buy salt and some necessary supplies. The town was still the same, small and familiar. The government road was dusty. The grocery store was half open. Men stood leaning against wooden posts, talking about the weather and the harvest-safe topics Dry Creek always chose. Caleb had no intention of staying long. He worked quickly, paid neatly, and headed outside. But at that moment he felt a gaze upon him, not rude, not overt, just enough to awaken the instincts of a man from the frontier. The man stood near the bar. He was dressed more neatly than necessary for Dry Creek. His coat was spotless. His shoes were polished. There was no sign of someone accustomed to mud or cold winds. And his eyes, they didn't look like those of someone from the West. Those weren't the eyes of someone constantly observing the weather, the livestock, or the safe path. They were the eyes of someone searching for information. The stranger approached, smiling politely. "Are you Hawthorne?" he asked. Caleb nodded, nothing more, nothing less. "I hear your ranch is near Red Willow Valley." The other man continued, his voice as light as a breeze. "There are some new women living there, aren't there?" The question was nothing unusual if it had been asked by someone in town, but coming from this man's mouth it carried a different weight. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked directly at the person opposite him. "Who did you hear that from?" Caleb asked. The man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "News spreads quickly, even in small places." Caleb didn't like that answer. In the West, news spreads quickly because people know each other, not because they're following a spy. He ended the conversation with a brief nod, then left. But all the way back to the ranch, the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't clear, it had no shape, but it was enough to remind him of the letter Margaret had given him. When Caleb arrived back at the ranch, he didn't tell anyone right away. He observed first. He observed the small signs that others might have missed. Luke reports that a stranger inquired at Dry Creek about the Hawthorne Ranch. Thomas overheard a strange conversation in the pub. Samuel says the mailman has been staying longer than usual lately before leaving. There's no evidence, no direct action. Just disjointed pieces, but they're not a coincidence. Caleb began to realize something that sent chills down his spine. This was no longer a misunderstanding. Margaret noticed the change in him even before he said anything. It was the way he stood closer to the door each evening. The way he gazed at the road leading to the ranch longer. The way he checked the barn lock even when there wasn't much wind. One evening when the men had finished their work, Margaret stood beside Caleb on the porch. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the familiar scent of dry grass. She didn't ask any questions. "Someone came to Dry Creek," she said. Caleb nodded. "Not just one." Margaret didn't ask any further questions. She knew that from this moment on, everything needed to be faced head-on. No panic, no running away, just preparation. The four Callahan sisters were unaware of the full extent of the situation, but they sensed a change in the atmosphere. Abigail went out into town less often. Eleanor was more cautious when speaking to strangers. Grace no longer ran to the gate at the sound of horse hooves. Ranch Hawthorne remains peaceful, but it's a wary peace, like a still lake concealing a hidden undercurrent. Caleb didn't say it out loud, but in his heart the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The strange man in Dry Creek, the seemingly innocuous questions, the interest directed at the women who had come from the east. He remembered the name Margaret had mentioned, Edgar Whitmore. No confirmation was needed. Caleb knew the thread from the past had reached the present, and once power begins to probe its path, it rarely stops simply because of the kindness of others. That night Caleb sat alone in the stable, the oil lamp casting long shadows on the wooden walls. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he understood that this time what they faced wasn't harsh nature or scarcity, but a force accustomed to using law and money as weapons. Ranch Hawthorne wasn't built to withstand things like that, but it was built by people who weren't easily subdued. Caleb stood up and closed the barn door. He knew that from now on every decision he made would not only be about protecting the ranch, but also about protecting the people who had placed their faith in this place. And just as the first signs of danger emerged silently but clearly, the deeper truths of the Callahan family's past were approaching a point where they could no longer be concealed, a confession in the night where everything would no longer remain within the safe zone of silence. Nights in Red Willow Valley are usually very quiet. Not a frightening kind of quiet, but the tranquility of the land accustomed to the wind, to the darkness, to the coming and going of people. That night was no different. The moon hung low. Its light was thin as a veil over the prairie, enough to see the outline of the fence, enough to recognize that the Hawthorne Ranch still stood firm. Caleb Hawthorne wasn't asleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the oil lamp burning dimly. Not because he was too worried to sleep, but because he was waiting. There are things, once they are close, that one shouldn't try to escape with sleep. Margaret Callahan entered shortly afterwards. She hadn't brought the letter. It wasn't necessary. What needed to be said had transcended the realm of paper and ink. She sat down opposite Caleb, not hurried, not nervous, but her hands rested tighter on the table than usual, as if to hold back the memories from flooding back too quickly. "I owe you an explanation," Margaret said. Her voice was low, even neither apologetic nor justifiable. Caleb nodded. "I'm listening." Margaret gazed at the oil lamp for a long time, then began. Not from the time they left the East, nor from the time the letters appeared. She began with their father. The father of the four Callahan sisters was not a man of large gatherings or speeches. He was a man of the desk, of sprawling blueprints of sleepless nights, refining every minute detail. He believed in progress. He believed that honest labor and intellect could pave the way for a family to live a decent life. He was an inventor. Not famous, not wealthy, but good enough to attract attention. Margaret recounted the early days when their father's work began to attract attention. Promises of collaboration, handshakes that lasted longer than necessary, and then the terms changed. Paperwork that their father no longer had the authority to review. Decisions made in his absence. He didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. The project bears someone else's name, the profits flow elsewhere, and the fame he didn't seek has become a trap, preventing him from withdrawing quietly. Margaret did not tell the story with resentment. She told it as someone who had lived through the pain long enough to know that anger does not make the truth clearer. "Our father didn't die of poverty," she said. "He died of shame." Caleb fell silent. He understood the difference. In the West, people could endure hardship, but being stripped of their honor, that was a wound that would never heal. Their father was burdened with responsibilities that were not his. He was controlled by laws, by debt, by forced silence. When he died, the Callahan family lost not only their breadwinner, they lost their right to speak the truth. Margaret recounted the years that followed. Men visited their home with polite business cards. Advice offered for the common good. Warnings were spoken in a gentle tone but left no room for refusal. And that name Edgar Whitmore doesn't appear as a villain in the story. He appears like the dangerous men who often appear with a perfectly composed smile, with widespread influence, and with the ability to make others disappear from the chessboard without a word. We left, Margaret said, not out of fear, but because staying meant continuing to live in a story that had been written incorrectly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He didn't interrupt. He let each word find its place within him. We didn't bring much, Margaret continued. Just each other. And the only thing my father left behind, the belief that living authentically sometimes requires leaving behind familiar things. Caleb looked at the woman before him. She was no longer just the keeper of the ranch's rhythm, but someone who carried a past heavier than any baggage. So Margaret said softly, "If you feel we're causing you trouble, you have the right to say no." The silence stretched on. The wind blew through the cracks in the door. The oil lamp flickered gently. Caleb stood up, not to leave but to move closer. He placed his hand on the table, not touching Margaret but close enough for her to know he was there. "I don't see choosing to live authentically as a problem," Caleb said. "In this land, it's the rarest thing." He didn't promise to protect them from everything. He didn't speak in grandiose words, but in his voice was the steadfastness of a man accustomed to standing before storms without turning his back. "I just need to know," Caleb continued, "whether you're prepared to face the consequences if the past doesn't leave you alone." Margaret looked up. "We've been facing each other our whole lives." Caleb nodded. "That's enough." That night they sat together for a long time. Not to plan, just to understand each other. At an age that the audience of this story is very familiar with, when people are no longer looking for impulsive emotions but for someone who can look straight at the truth with them. When Margaret rose to leave the ranch, Hawthorne remained as quiet as before. But Caleb knew that from this moment on that quiet had changed in meaning. It was no longer a safe silence but a serenity in the face of a choice with no turning back. And it was that acknowledgement that night, without fanfare, without tears, that laid the foundation for the momentous decision to come, where Caleb would have to choose not only between right and wrong but between preserving the ranch or siding with those who chose to live right, even knowing the price would be high. There are choices in life that don't come with a loud call. They come on very ordinary mornings when the sun still rises, the livestock still need tending, and the land still demands that people continue to work as if nothing had ever changed. But those choices once made leave no room for turning back. Caleb Hawthorne understands that better than anyone. After the night, Margaret revealed the truth. Caleb didn't sleep much. Not because he was panicking, but because he was doing what he had done his whole life, considering responsibility. Only one difference this time: responsibility wasn't confined to the boundaries of Hawthorne Ranch. He rode out to the fields early in the morning. The morning wind blew across the Red Willow Valley prairie, cold and familiar. He looked at the fence, the stables, the granary, one by one. Every inch of land here bore the imprint of his hand, of his father of years, witnessed by no one but themselves. This ranch is not just property, it's a life. But then other images entered Caleb's mind: Margaret by the stove, Abigail keeping track of expenses, Eleanor reading by the oil lamp, Grace laughing as Samuel told silly stories. These people weren't in his life plan, but they were here. And more importantly, they belonged here in a way no document could record. Caleb knew that if he chose to preserve the ranch at all costs, the path would be clear. All it took was a word, a timely retreat. The Callahan family could leave before things got more complicated. Whitmore, either way, would have no reason to continue the pursuit. Ranch Hawthorne will be safe. Hawthorne's name will not be dragged into the East Coast affair. Everything will go on as before. It is a choice for survival. But Caleb also knew that if he did that, one thing would never come back: his belief in himself. He recalled the years after his parents passed away, times when he could have sold the land, left, and started over somewhere else. But he didn't. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he didn't want to live with the question, if I had stayed, would things have been different? Now that question has returned. Only this time it no longer revolves around land, it revolves around people. Caleb called his brothers together, not to ask for their opinions, but to tell them the truth. Luke listened, remaining silent for a moment. Then he nodded decisively. "Whatever you choose, I'll follow." Not out of blind loyalty, but because Luke understood the value of standing together. Thomas became more pensive. He asked a few questions about the possibility of losing the ranch, about the potential consequences. Then he said slowly, "If we have to lose it, let's lose it for the right reason." Samuel was the most emotionally reactive. He didn't hide his fear, but he didn't back down either. "If they leave, this place will be empty," he said. "Not just home, but us." None of them mentioned Whitmore. It wasn't necessary. That name carried enough weight. That evening, Caleb spoke with Margaret. No beating around the bush. No reassurances. "If I side with the kids," he said, "I might lose the ranch." Margaret wasn't surprised. She had prepared for that statement. "We didn't come here seeking shelter," she replied. "If you choose to withdraw, we'll understand." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "I'm not choosing to back down." That statement wasn't uttered as an oath. It was spoken as a decided truth. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. She just bowed slightly, like someone more accustomed to receiving responsibility than favor. Caleb stood up and stepped out onto the porch. The night in Red Willow Valley was quiet. The sky was vast, the stars sparse. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold seep into his lungs. It was the cold he had lived with his whole life, and it reminded him that if one doesn't hold on, one can collapse very quickly. He thought of Whitmore, of money, paperwork, laws, things that couldn't be confronted with guns or brute force. He knew his choice wasn't heroic, wasn't noble. It was simply a path of loss. But there are losses that, if avoided, will leave a much larger void. The next morning, Caleb went down to Dry Creek, not to buy or sell, to show up. He stood there talking, listening, not avoiding the gaze of strangers, not retreating. In the West, sometimes simply standing still in the right place was a statement. The news spread, not loudly, but enough for those who needed to know Caleb Hawthorne had not cut ties with the Callahan family. Quite the opposite. Ranch Hawthorne isn't closing. But it's not bowing its head either. That's a choice with no turning back. Caleb returned to the ranch at the end of the day. He saw everyone working as usual. No one asked him what he had decided, but in their eyes there was a quiet anticipation. Caleb didn't say much. He just said one thing: "We're together. That's enough." From that moment, Ranch Hawthorne was no longer just a place of refuge. It became a stance. And when a man chooses to protect people over property, he is not just confronting others, he is confronting an entire system that uses power to silence people. And it was this unwavering, silent choice that left no room for retreat, that prevented the opposing forces from continuing to stand idly by, because when honor is challenged, the villain will not wait long to strike. Edgar Whitmore didn't arrive on horseback or with gunfire. He arrived with papers. That is what made his presence more terrifying than any armed man who had ever passed through Red Willow Valley. News reached Hawthorne Ranch one cloudy morning just as Caleb was checking the winter food supplies. The mailman arrived earlier than usual, his face averted. He said little, only handed over a thick envelope sealed with a red stamp and signed by Dry Creek Bank. Caleb opened the letter right there on the porch. There are no threats, no harsh tone. Just cold, precise words written without emotion. The Hawthorne Ranch's debt, an old, seemingly dormant loan, has been acquired. The new creditor, Edgar Whitmore. Caleb read it again, then a third time. He wasn't surprised. He just felt a terrifying confirmation. What he feared had come to pass, and it had come exactly the way Whitmore always did. Whitmore didn't vandalize. He tightened his grip. The Dry Creek Bank changed its attitude almost immediately. The manager, who had previously shaken Caleb's hand every time they met, now spoke cautiously. The loan terms were reviewed. Details that had previously never been an issue now became reasons for delays. Luke was the first to notice the difference. When he went to buy supplies, the seller said the prices had gone up. Thomas overheard the murmurs in the pub, questions asked not to inquire but to sow doubt. Samuel was being asked too many questions by a stranger about the ranch, about the women who lived there. Whitmore didn't need to be there. He was everywhere. Margaret realized this even before Caleb said it. She had lived within that circle herself. An invisible network where everyone did their part, no one was held accountable, but everyone contributed. One afternoon, Whitmore appeared at Dry Creek. He stepped down from the clean carriage, his coat perfectly fitted, his hat neatly adjusted. The townspeople looked at him with a mixture of caution and respect, the kind of respect reserved for those with money and power, regardless of whether they had known each other for a long time. Whitmore wasn't in a hurry to get to the ranch. He stopped at the bank first, then the pub, then the grocery store. At each location he spoke very little, only polite pleasantries, general remarks about maintaining order, protecting public interests, and unusual elements that could cause instability. No one objected. No one publicly agreed. But public opinion doesn't need confirmation, it just needs a suggestion in the right place. Caleb went down to town the next day. He wasn't looking for Whitmore. But Whitmore was looking for him. They met in front of the bank. Edgar Whitmore didn't look like an enemy. He resembled a successful, calm man accustomed to being listened to. "Mr. Hawthorne Whitmore," said his voice gentle, "your ranch has a good history. It would be a shame if it were to suffer because of unnecessary connections." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked directly at Whitmore. "He bought my debt," Caleb said. "Not to help." Whitmore smiled. "I buy what's legal." That's the answer Whitmore always gave. Legal. Proper procedure. Emotionless. "The Callahan family brings trouble," Whitmore continued. "I think you're wise enough to understand that." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. Not from fear, but from recognizing a familiar tactic. Whitmore wasn't threatening. He was presenting a false choice, either keep the ranch or keep the people. And he believed that everyone would choose wealth. Caleb didn't raise his voice. "This ranch isn't for sale," he said. Whitmore tilted his head as if considering something interesting. "Not every sale requires consent." Those words stayed with Caleb all the way home. In Hawthorne Ranch everything seemed normal, but that normalcy was beginning to take on a bitter taste. Margaret heard whispers from the town. Abigail noticed the shopkeepers weren't as friendly anymore. Eleanor felt strange eyes following her down Dry Creek. Grace could no longer laugh as freely as before. Whitmore did what he did best: isolate. Without resorting to violence, he made Hawthorne Ranch a hotbed of unrest in the eyes of the community. A place with problems. A place connected to East Coast trouble. That's a very real fear for older Americans, the fear of being abandoned by the system, of having their loans foreclosed on by the banks, of being viewed differently by the community. It doesn't need to be a direct attack. It just needs to be that no one is left to stand by them. Caleb called his brothers over. He didn't hide the situation. Luke clenched his fists. Thomas was silent for a long time. Samuel asked directly, "How much longer do we have?" Caleb doesn't know, and that's what's scary. Margaret stood beside him, silent. She understood Whitmore better than anyone. She knew this was only the first blow. That night, the ranch Hawthorne was sleepless. No one panicked, but everyone understood that they were facing a danger that could not be overcome by force. Whitmore struck. Slow, cold, precise. And when power began to tighten its grip, it didn't need to rush, for it believed that time was always on its side. But Whitmore forgot one thing. There are families built not on money or paperwork, but on steadfastness. And it is this steadfastness that will force people to stand up and face things directly, no longer avoiding them. A public confrontation, where words become oaths, and truth is no longer hidden behind the doors of power. That morning began with an unusual stillness. Not the quiet of the windy steppe, but the silence of people who sensed something was about to happen. Caleb Hawthorne was inspecting the eastern fence when he heard the sound of hooves. Not fast, not hurried, but there was more than one. He straightened his back, squinting toward the dirt road leading into the ranch. A light dust rose, then settled. 3 figures gradually emerged. Edgar Whitmore is in the middle. He wore a dark coat, clean leather gloves, and a neatly tied hat. 2 policemen on horseback followed behind, looking weary, like men simply carrying out their assigned duties, nothing more. Caleb didn't run into the house. He didn't call out to anyone. He stood there in the middle of the ranch yard like someone who had decided not to back down another step. Whitmore dismounted first. He looked around, assessing as if everything here were a number that could be recorded in a ledger. The stables, the granary, the wooden house. He nodded slightly, a polite gesture that was cold. "Mr. Hawthorne," Whitmore said, "I've come to settle a matter that needs to be settled." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He turned his head and shouted, not a cry for help, just an announcement. Luke, Thomas, Samuel. The 3 younger brothers appeared quickly, each from a different direction. None carried weapons. None showed any provocation. They stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, just as they had stood together in the cold wind and drought for years. Margaret came out next. Then Abigail, Eleanor, and Grace. They stood behind the Hawthorne brothers, not to hide but to be present. Margaret placed her hand on Grace's shoulder. Abigail straightened her back. Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes calm. No one cried. No one pleaded. Whitmore glanced at the scene very quickly. He turned to the policeman and handed him a stack of papers. "We're here under legal order," Whitmore said, his voice neither high nor low. "The Hawthorne Ranch's debt is overdue. The new creditor has the right to request an inventory and prepare for asset seizure." The policeman held the paper, cleared his throat, and read a few lines without looking at anyone. The dry words fell into the courtyard like stones into a dry well. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. When the officer finished reading, Whitmore stepped forward. "You can cooperate," he said, "or this will become more difficult than necessary." Caleb looked directly at Whitmore. "Difficult, for whom?" he asked. Whitmore smiled slightly. "For those who are not involved." His gaze swept over the 4 Callahan sisters, then lingered for a second longer than politely would have. Caleb understood. This wasn't a conversation about money. This was coercion wrapped in legal language. He took a step forward, just enough to stand between Whitmore and the people behind him. No one stopped him. No one pulled him back. "The people he says are unrelated," Caleb said slowly. "Are my family." Whitmore tilted his head slightly. "I don't see any documents to prove that." Caleb didn't turn to look at Margaret. He didn't need to. His voice was deep and clear, as if each word had been carefully considered. "Family isn't always on paper," he said. "But they're here." A long silence followed. The wind blew. The barn door creaked. The policeman glanced at Whitmore, then at Caleb. He wasn't a ruthless man. He was just someone accustomed to the law, often winning over emotion. "Mr. Hawthorne," the police officer said, "we're just following procedure." Caleb nodded. "I understand." Then he continued, speaking directly to Whitmore. "If you want this ranch, you'll have to take it while we're all standing here. Not a threat. Not a challenge. A declaration." Whitmore stared at Caleb for a long time. He wasn't angry. Not confused. But in his eyes there was a rare hint of displeasure, not because Caleb was defying him, but because Caleb wasn't playing by the rules he was used to. Whitmore took a deep breath. "You're making things more complicated." Caleb didn't answer. He turned to his brothers. Luke nodded. Thomas stood firm. Samuel swallowed hard but didn't step back. Then he turned to Margaret. Margaret looked at him. No questions. No pleas. Just the quiet trust of someone who understands that in some moments words cannot be taken back. Caleb turned around to face Whitmore. "You can bring your papers," he said. "You can bring the police. But you can't force us to leave each other behind." His voice wasn't loud. But every word felt like a stake driven into the ground. The policeman put down the papers. He looked at Whitmore, waiting for instructions. Whitmore hesitated for a moment, very briefly, but enough to reveal that he hadn't expected this unity. "We'll be back," Whitmore said finally. "It's not over yet." Caleb nodded. "Me too." Whitmore turned around. The police followed. Dust rose again, then settled. The road leading out of the ranch was empty once more. There were no cheers, no hurried hugs, only breaths exhaled after being held for so long. Margaret walked over to Caleb. She didn't say thank you. She just whispered, "You already told me." Caleb looked around. Ranch Hawthorne was still there. But from this moment on, it was no longer just a disputed piece of land. It was where a man had staked his life on a word, turning a choice into a vow. And it was precisely when Whitmore departed in that reluctant silence that something else began to shift, for the oath just spoken would force the truth to come to light, and what had been hidden in the past would now speak for itself. After Whitmore left Hawthorne Ranch with the police, the atmosphere there was no longer just superficially tense. It became subdued like the ground after a heavy rain, no more strong winds, but everyone knew things were shifting beneath the surface. Caleb didn't say more than necessary. He continued his daily routine as usual, but his eyes often lingered longer on small details: the soft creaking of the wooden door, the sound of the sewing needle touching the fabric, the seemingly inanimate objects that had been there for a very long time. It is from things like these that the secret begins to unfold. The old blanket Margaret Callahan had brought from the east was nothing special. It was thin, worn, and faded to gray. Grace often used it on colder nights, and Eleanor carefully folded it each morning. To them it was simply a memento, the last vestige of a bygone era without explanation. Margaret never mentioned the blanket, nor did she ever try to hide it. But there are artifacts that weren't created to be displayed. They wait for the right moment. One afternoon, when the wind was blowing stronger than usual, Caleb went inside to find more firewood. He found Margaret sitting at the table, a blanket spread out in front of her. Not to warm herself, but to look at. She was using her fingertips to trace the seams. Very slowly, very focused. Caleb paused. He didn't ask immediately. "Have you ever thought," Margaret began, "that there are things parents leave to their children? Not to remember, but to understand?" Caleb didn't answer. He pulled up a chair and sat down opposite him. Margaret pointed to the blanket. "My father sewed it himself." That statement made Caleb look up. Not out of surprise, but because of the meaning behind it. Margaret continued, her voice even devoid of any superfluous emotion. "Their father was more than just an inventor. He was a man who always thought one step ahead, especially when he felt cornered. In his final years, when the blueprints were taken away, when the papers no longer belonged to him, he began to leave traces in unexpected ways. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't keep public records. He encrypted his memories. The blanket is part of it." Margaret recounted that as a child she wondered why the stitches on her blanket were never even. Her father simply smiled and said, "Some things, if too perfect, will be copied." She didn't understand then. Now she does. Eleanor entered, carrying an old book. When Margaret asked her about it, Eleanor recalled a detail. The patterns on the blanket, the seemingly random geometric stitches, matched the symbols in an old technical book their father had read. When Thomas was called in, he recognized it immediately. He had seen similar symbols in old mechanical drawings, ways of marking positions, sequences, and connections. Everything fits together, unhurried, without drama, just eerily logical. They spread the blanket completely out. Under the oil lamp, the stitching became more visible. Not a pattern. It was a map. Not a geographical map, but a map of the document, its hiding place, how to access it, the order in which to unlock it. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. Not from fear, but from the long preparation of a father who knew he would no longer have the chance to tell the truth. Margaret bowed her head. "He couldn't defend his honor while he was alive," she said, "so he left us a way to do it. If we ever find the courage." The blanket doesn't just lead to one place. It leads to a storage system, copies, notes, evidence of who was credited with the work, who signed on behalf of others who benefited. Edgar Whitmore's name isn't mentioned in the quilt, but his fingerprints are everywhere. Caleb said nothing throughout the whole process. He understood better than anyone the significance of what had just been discovered. This wasn't a weapon for revenge. This was the truth kept intact, waiting to be put in its proper place. Grace sat silently throughout the entire time. When everyone looked up, she spoke very softly. "Our father didn't want to win by destroying. He just wanted things to be called by their proper names." That statement brought silence to the room. For older people, those who have lived long enough to understand the value of honor, this twist isn't a shock. It's confirmation that justice doesn't always come quickly. But if you're well prepared, it will come at the right time. Caleb stood up and carefully folded the blanket. He placed it on the table as if it were a sacred object. "We won't rush," he said. "The truth doesn't need to be shouted." Margaret nodded. She knew that from this moment on they were no longer entirely passive. Whitmore had power. He had money. He had a system. But he lacked this proof preserved by memory and patience. That night Hawthorne Ranch was quieter than usual. No one went to bed early. No one spoke much. But within each person there was a new feeling, not a vague hope, but a quiet certainty. And it was when the old quilt, thought to be merely a memento, revealed a secret sewn shut over the years, that the scales of power began to tilt slightly enough to signal that Whitmore's downfall was imminent, and that his collapse would not come through violence or hatred, but through the light of truth being put to good use. Edgar Whitmore's downfall didn't happen amidst shouting or dazzling lights. It began the way all important things usually begin, with silence. The documents were sent without any accompanying incriminating letters. There were no serious accusations. just carefully arranged copies, the details fitting together so perfectly that no further explanation was needed. Caleb didn't send them directly. Neither did Margaret. They chose to let the truth find its way like groundwater, slow but impossible to block forever. The papers traveled from Red Willow Valley to distant desks in the east, places Whitmore was familiar with, places he had entered with the air of someone in control. This time his name appeared in the files not as the decision-maker but as the subject of investigation. In Dry Creek things didn't change immediately. The town still opened every morning. The pub still had people sitting in it. The bank still displayed its old interest rates. But those who had once avoided the Hawthorne family's gaze began to slow down as they passed the ranch. Not because they were braver, but because the wind had changed direction. Caleb noticed it through subtle details. The supplyman no longer beat around the bush. The Dry Creek bank manager had become more cautious in his speech, no longer as absolutely confident as before. The whispered questions in the pub no longer carried the same certainty. Suspicion, which Whitmore had once used as a weapon, was now turning against him. The news didn't come quickly, but it was clear enough to be undeniable. Edgar Whitmore was under investigation. Not because of a single action, but because of a series of choices spanning many years now viewed together in a new light. Signatories, unusual debts, projects with changed ownership. All are legal individually, but when put together they form a picture that can no longer be called a coincidence. Margaret read the replies in the kitchen, her voice unchanged. No glee, no premature relief. She understood better than anyone that for people like Whitmore the most painful thing wasn't losing money, it was losing control of the narrative. Whitmore did not return to Hawthorne Ranch. He also did not send any more police. Instead, he silently withdrew. A man who once strode into Dry Creek with such a confident bearing was gone. The clean horse-drawn carriages did not return. The bank visits ceased. Edgar Whitmore vanished from this small town just as he had appeared, no explanation needed. But this silence carried a different meaning. Caleb heard from the mailman. Whitmore had sold the debts, not for profit but to sever ties. The Eastern Bank had sent a letter requesting clarification on some old terms. The tone was polite but no longer favorable. At Hawthorne Ranch nobody celebrated. Nobody opened a bottle of wine. Nobody said, "We won." They continued to live. Luke repaired the fence. Thomas read in the evenings. Samuel smiled more often. Abigail kept a neat record of expenses. Eleanor brought light into the dark corners of the house. Grace hummed softly while working in the yard. And Margaret, she just breathed a little slower. Caleb observed it all from a distance. He understood that what had just happened wasn't a victory. It was the end of a cycle where power, once manipulative, was now forced to retreat before the unvarnished truth. One afternoon, Caleb and Margaret sat on the porch. They didn't say much. They just gazed at the vast prairie. A gentle breeze blew. The feeling of being watched was gone. "He won't be coming back," Margaret said. Not with absolute certainty, but as someone accustomed to reading the signs of the world. Caleb nodded. "It's not because we're stronger," he said. "It's because he no longer has a place." Margaret looked at him. "My father used to say there are people who live in the shadows. When the light shines on them, they don't fight. They retreat." For older audiences, those who lived through bank foreclosures, silent crises, and very real fears of being crushed by the system, this downfall doesn't taste of revenge. It tastes of profound satisfaction that sometimes steadfastness and truth still have a place in a cold, power-driven world. Whitmore wasn't handcuffed in public. He wasn't publicly shamed in the Dry Creek tabloid. He simply no longer had the power to control other people's destinies. And for people like him, that was a complete failure. Ranch Hawthorne stands strong, not because it was unharmed, but because it was rebuilt on a different foundation. It's no longer just land and paperwork. It's a relationship that cannot be bought, cannot be forced. One evening, as the oil lamps were lit, Caleb looked around the dining table. 4 brothers, 4 women. No one was a guest anymore. No one was a burden anymore. Whitmore withdrew in silence and humiliation. No one needed to say it because everyone could sense it. And it is in that silence that a new chapter awaits to be written, no longer revolving around struggle or confrontation, but around legacy, what will be preserved, what will be built, and how these wounded individuals choose to move forward, not to prove anything to the world, but to live a kinder, deeper life. and truly belong to one another. Spring arrives in Red Willow Valley without fanfare. It arrives as enduring things usually do, slowly, steadily, and without needing any announcement. The snow melts at the foot of the hedge. The ground is softer underfoot. The wind still blows, but it no longer carries the chill that once compelled people to bundle up in their coats. Ranch Hawthorne entered a new, unnamed phase. No one said that everything had ended well, but everyone sensed that something had settled down. After Edgar Whitmore's silent withdrawal, there was no family gathering to declare victory. No grand plans were drawn up. Caleb Hawthorne continued his work as usual, tending the livestock, repairing the fence, inspecting the granary. But in each of these small tasks, he no longer felt the need to hold everything together alone. Luke Hawthorne was the first to say what everyone already understood. One evening, as he and Abigail Callahan were washing dishes after dinner, Luke stopped, dried them, and said very directly, "We don't need to rush. But I want to know. Would you like to stay even when everything is settled?" Abigail looked at him for a long time. Not to consider the circumstances, but to consider the man. "I'm not here because I need shelter," she said. "I'm here because I chose to. No rings, no grand promises, just a deep enough understanding for both of them to continue walking in the same direction." Thomas Hawthorne and Eleanor Callahan were different. They didn't need such an explicit conversation. One afternoon, Thomas brought Eleanor an old book he'd found in Dry Creek. Eleanor took it, smiled, and placed it on the shelf with the others. It stayed. For them, choosing each other happened quietly, like the way they gradually placed their memories side by side without disturbing or taking each other's place. Samuel Hawthorne and Grace Callahan possessed the innocence of those untouched by the harsh realities of life. But precisely because of this, their choices were far from naive. Samuel once asked Grace one early morning outside the stables if she feared life, a life without wealth and uncertainty. Grace responded by placing her hand on the wooden fence, gazing out at the prairie. "If I must be afraid," she said, "I want to be afraid with someone I trust." Caleb Hawthorne saw all of this from afar. He didn't intervene. He didn't offer guidance. He was used to keeping his distance, but now that distance was no longer a barrier, it was respect. And then, it was his turn. Caleb and Margaret Callahan never spoke of the future in the way young people usually do. They spoke of the coming winter, of fixing the roof, of children who might arrive in the distant future, not as a dream but as a possibility to prepare for. One evening, as the oil lamp cast long shadows on the wooden wall, Caleb said something very simple to Margaret. "If you stay, I can't promise life will be easy." Margaret nodded. "I didn't come here looking for an easy life." Caleb looked at her. No longer the wary gaze of the early days, but the gaze of a man who understood that before him was someone who could share the responsibility without calling it a sacrifice. They didn't get married right away. Not because they were hesitant, but because they understood that the family was already formed before the ceremony. The ceremony was merely the final confirmation. Ranch Hawthorne, once a place where 4 men lived together, has become a true family, not perfect, not noisy, but with its own rhythm. Meals lasted longer. Evenings were illuminated with more light. Moments of silence were no longer empty. People began calling this place Hawthorne House, not just because of the name on paper, but because of the way the people there treated each other. Caleb sometimes sits alone on the porch watching people go about their lives inside. He thinks of his parents. He thinks of the years he spent trying to keep the ranch from falling apart. He realizes he has built something more important than the land itself. A legacy that cannot be bought or confiscated. Margaret took the old blanket out to dry in the sun one early summer day. It was still worn, still imperfect, but now it was no longer a hiding place for secrets. It was a symbol of a truth that had been given its proper name and a future built on voluntary choice. For those who have lived through decades of life, audiences over 55 who have experienced loss, rebuilt, and understood that not every victory is loud and clear, this story doesn't end with a triumph. It ends with serenity. Ranch Hawthorne continues to exist, but more importantly, it lives. And if someone were to ask what kept them together, the answer wouldn't lie in major events, but in the ordinary days of living decently. Because after all, what Caleb Hawthorne and those he loved learned and left behind as a legacy is a simple, enduring truth that never goes out of style. The most valuable things in life cannot be bought, only built. From the story, 4 brothers each ordered mail-order brides. The women arrived were all sisters seeking for love. There is a quiet but enduring lesson, especially relevant to those who have lived through many years of their lives. Life doesn't always present us with easy choices. Often what's right doesn't come with security, and security can lead us to lose ourselves. Caleb Hawthorne didn't choose to protect his possessions at all costs, but chose to protect people because he understood that houses can be rebuilt, but dignity and trust once lost are very difficult to regain. That's a lesson for anyone who has ever stood at the crossroads of self-interest and conscience. The story also reminds us that true love doesn't come from explosive emotions, but is formed from enduring presence, respect, and shared burdens. In the Hawthorne Ranch, no one saved anyone. They chose to walk together day by day in the smallest things, and it is these small things that create a true home. Another profound message is, the truth can be hidden, but it cannot be erased. The old blanket, the preserved memories, and the patience demonstrated that justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be timely and persistent enough. In today's world where everything seems readily available for purchase, this story reminds us that the most valuable things, family, honor, peace of mind, can only be built through time and careful choices. Thank you for staying until the end of the story, for listening with both your experience and your heart. If this story gave you a moment of reflection, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue journeying with other healing, slow-paced, and humane stories. We will meet again in the lands of memories, kindness, and enduring faith.